A harsh critic tasted the teen dishwasher's food. The whole restaurant couldn't believe what happened next. The steam from the industrial dishwasher hit Luca's face like a slap, but he'd learned not to flinch. At 17, his hands were already scarred from 1,000 cuts, not from knives, but from broken plates, shattered glasses, and the sharp edges of a life that seemed determined to slice him apart piece by piece. "Move faster, you worthless piece of," Chef Dubois's voice cut through the kitchen noise like a cleaver through bone. The words weren't even directed at Luca specifically. They were just part of the symphony of cruelty that played every night at Le Cygne Noir, the most prestigious restaurant in their small seaside town of Crescent Harbor. Luca kept his head down, scrubbing at a plate that had held someone's $100 meal while his own stomach gnawed at itself. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's leftover bread crusts, the ones he'd found in the dumpster behind the bakery on his way to work. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent 14 hours a day surrounded by exquisite food he could never afford to taste. But tonight felt different. Wrong. The kitchen was chaos incarnate. Servers rushed past him with panic in their eyes, their usual arrogant swagger replaced by something that looked dangerously close to terror. Through the pass window, Luca could see the dining room. Every table filled with the kind of people who wore their wealth like armor, completely unaware that the restaurant they'd chosen for their special evening was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. "Where's the lamb for table 7?" screamed sous chef Martinez, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to hold everything together. "The sauce is broken," came another voice from the guard manger station. The soufflé collapsed. Luca had learned to read the kitchen's moods like others read weather patterns. Tonight's storm had been building for weeks. Ever since the news broke that Victoria Ashford, the food critic whose reviews could close restaurants with a single star or launch careers with 4, had made a reservation. Tonight, right now, she was sitting at table 12, a woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back so severely it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent expression of distaste. Luca had glimpsed her through the pass window, elegant, cold, with eyes that seemed to dissect everything they looked at. The kind of woman who could smell fear and weakness from across a room. And she was about to taste the food that would determine whether Le Cygne Noir survived or joined the graveyard of failed restaurants that littered the coast. "Luca," he turned to find Marie, one of the younger servers, clutching a tray of dirty dishes. Her mascara was running, tears mixing with sweat in the oppressive heat of the kitchen. "They're saying she's going to destroy us," Marie whispered, loading plates into his station with shaking hands. "Victoria Ashford. They're saying she's already decided. That she came here to finish us off." Luca wanted to comfort her, but what could he say? That everything would be okay? They both knew better. The restaurant had been hemorrhaging money for months. Chef Dubois's signature dishes, elaborate, pretentious creations that looked beautiful but tasted like expensive disappointment, had been driving customers away steadily. The only reason they were still open was because the owner, Monsieur Beaumont, had been too proud to admit failure. Until now. Through the kitchen's chaos, Luca caught sight of Chef Dubois near the stove, and his blood ran cold. The head chef wasn't shouting anymore. Instead, he stood frozen, staring down at a plate with the glazed eyes of a man watching his world crumble. His signature dish, duck confit with cherry gastrique and microgreens arranged like tiny works of art, sat before him, and even from across the kitchen, Luca could see that something was terribly wrong. The duck was overcooked. The sauce had separated. The presentation looked like it had been assembled by a child having a tantrum. This was the dish going to Victoria Ashford, the dish that would seal their fate. "I can't." Chef Dubois's voice was barely audible over the kitchen noise, but Luca heard him. "I can't do this anymore." And then, as if in slow motion, the most feared chef in Crescent Harbor, the man who had made grown servers cry with a look, who had built his reputation on perfectionism and cruelty, began to shake. His hands trembled as he reached for his chef's coat, and when he looked up, his eyes were filled with something Luca had never seen there before: defeat. "Where are you going?" Sous Chef Martinez grabbed Dubois's arm as the head chef started walking toward the back exit. "It's over," Dubois said simply. "Tell Beaumont I'm sorry. Tell them all I'm sorry." And just like that, on the most important night in the restaurant's history, with Victoria Ashford waiting for her meal and the entire staff's livelihoods hanging in the balance, the head chef walked out the back door, and disappeared into the night. The kitchen fell silent for exactly 3 seconds, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath before a catastrophe. Then all hell broke loose. What do we do? Martinez was spinning in circles, his face pale as parchment. The critic's been waiting 20 minutes already. The other tables are getting restless. We're supposed to send out the signature dish, and we don't have a head chef. Cook something, Marie pleaded. Anything. I don't know how to make his dishes. None of us do. He never taught us the recipes, said they were trade secrets. Luca watched the panic spread through the kitchen like wildfire. And somewhere in the dining room, Victoria Ashford was checking her watch, preparing to write the review that would put 30 people out of work. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, as clear as if she were standing beside him. Sometimes, Bambino, the most important moments are the ones where nobody's watching, where you have to choose who you really are. Nana had died 3 years ago, taking with her the only love Luca had ever known. She'd raised him in a tiny apartment above her small Italian grocery store, filling their cramped kitchen with the scents of basil and garlic, teaching him that food wasn't just fuel, it was love made tangible. Everything he knew about cooking, he'd learned from her weathered hands and patient voice. But those weren't real cooking skills, were they? Not the kind that belonged in a place like Le Cygne Noir. He was just a dishwasher, a nobody, a boy who'd been thrown away by the world and forgotten by everyone who mattered. Except he knew flavors. He understood how ingredients talked to each other, how they fought and made peace, how they could tell stories that words never could. And deep in his chest, beneath layers of fear and self-doubt, something was stirring. As the kitchen continued to spiral into chaos around him, Luca made a decision that would change everything. He untied his dishwasher's apron. Nobody noticed at first. They were all too busy panicking, shouting orders at each other, and generally behaving like chickens with their heads cut off. Luca had become so invisible in this kitchen that he could have tap-danced naked, and they probably wouldn't have looked twice. But as he moved toward the walk-in cooler, Martinez spotted him. "Where the hell are you going?" "There are dishes piling up." Luca paused, his hand on the cooler door. For a moment, the old fear tried to grab him by the throat. The voice that had been whispering in his ear for 2 years that he was nothing, that he didn't belong, that he should keep his head down and be grateful for the scraps he was thrown. Then he thought about Nana, and that voice got a little quieter. "I'm going to cook," he said simply. The kitchen went quiet again. This time, the silence was different, not the shocked stillness of catastrophe, but the bewildered pause of people trying to process something that didn't make sense. Martinez laughed first. It was a harsh, bitter sound. "You? Cook? You're the dishwasher, kid. You don't even know how to hold a knife properly." "The critic is waiting," Lucas said, ignoring the laughter that was starting to ripple through the kitchen staff. "Someone has to cook for her." "Not someone," Martinez snapped. "Someone qualified. Someone trained. Someone who actually belongs in a kitchen like this." The words hit exactly where they were meant to, right in the soft spot where Luca kept all his insecurities and self-doubt. But they also hit something else, something harder and more resilient than Martinez probably expected. "Maybe," Luca said, pulling open the cooler door. "But I'm the someone who's here." He stepped into the cold, his breath misting in the chilled air as he surveyed the ingredients. This was the moment of truth, not just for the restaurant, but for every dream he'd been too afraid to admit he had. Because the truth was, Luca had been watching. For 2 years, while everyone assumed he was just mindlessly scrubbing plates, he'd been absorbing everything. Every technique, every flavor combination, every secret he could steal with his eyes and store in his memory. He'd been teaching himself, bit by bit, dish by dish. And late at night, in the tiny studio apartment he could barely afford, he'd been cooking. Taking the day-old vegetables from the market's dumpster, the discarded cuts of meat from the butcher, the stale bread from the bakery, and transforming them into something that tasted like home. Like love. Like the meals Nana used to make when the world felt too big and scary for a little boy who'd been abandoned by everyone who should have protected him. His hands moved without conscious thought, selecting ingredients with the instinct his grandmother had nurtured in him. Beef chuck. Not the expensive cuts that Du Bois would have demanded, but the tough, flavorful meat that Nana had taught him to coax into tenderness. Onions, carrots, celery, the holy trinity of flavor. Tomatoes, herbs, wine. "What are you doing?" Martinez had followed him into the cooler, his voice higher with each word. Put that down. You don't understand how this works. Then show me what you would cook, Lucas said calmly, not looking up from the ingredients he was gathering. Show me your plan to save everyone's job. Martinez opened his mouth, then closed it again. They both knew the truth. He had no plan. None of them did. They were trained to follow orders, not to create, not to improvise, not to step up when everything fell apart. But Luca had been improvising his whole life. He carried his ingredients back to the main kitchen, where the chaos had, if anything, gotten worse. Servers were hovering anxiously by the pass window, afraid to go back to the dining room empty-handed, but equally afraid to stay and witness whatever disaster was brewing. The other cooks had given up all pretense of working and were just standing around, waiting for someone else to solve their problems. He's lost his mind, one of them muttered as Luca claimed a section of the prep counter. Stress finally got to him, said another. Poor kid's been worked to death back there. Marie appeared at his elbow, her eyes wide with something between horror and hope. Luca, what are you doing? If Beaumont sees you. Beaumont's not here, Luca replied, pulling out a knife. Not one of the expensive German blades that the other cooks hoarded like treasures, but a simple, well-maintained chef's knife that he'd bought with his own money months ago. And neither is Du Bois. It's just us. He began to work, and muscle memory took over. His hands moved with the sure, steady rhythm that Nana had taught him, the knife rocking against the board in a gentle, hypnotic pattern. Onions fell away in perfect dice. Carrots surrendered to his blade in precise, uniform cuts. Celery submitted to his technique with barely a whisper. Around him, the kitchen gradually fell quiet again. But this time, it wasn't the silence of panic or confusion. It was the silence of people watching something they didn't understand but couldn't look away from. Jesus, someone whispered. Look at his knife work. Luca didn't hear them. He was lost in the meditation of cooking, in the familiar comfort of creation. Heat oil in a heavy pot. Not the fancy copper cookware that Du Bois treated like religious artifacts, but a simple, well-seasoned cast iron Dutch oven that would hold heat evenly and forgive mistakes. Brown the meat in batches, letting each piece develop that deep, caramelized crust that would become the foundation of flavor. Don't rush it. Don't crowd the pan. Let the ingredients do what they want to do. The smell began to change the kitchen's atmosphere. Where before there had been the acrid scent of stress and failure, now there was something warm and welcoming. Something that smelled like home. What is that? Martinez had moved closer, almost against his will. What are you making? Brasato al burrolo. Lucas said, though that wasn't quite right. It was more than that. It was Nana's brasato, evolved and refined by years of his own experimentation. My grandmother's recipe. Sort of. He added the vegetables to the pot, letting them soften and release their sweetness. Then wine. Not the expensive Barolo that the dish traditionally called for, but a simple red that would add depth without overwhelming the other flavors. The liquid hit the hot pot with a satisfying hiss, filling the air with the rich scent of alcohol cooking off. This is insane, Martinez was saying, but his voice had lost its edge. You can't serve this to Victoria Ashford. It's not restaurant food. It's just stew. It's not just stew, Marie said softly. She was standing close enough that Luca could feel her watching his every move. I can smell it from here, and God, it smells incredible. Stock went into the pot next, not the refined, clarified consommé that Du Bois would have demanded, but a rich, gelatinous broth that Luca had made himself from bones he'd collected over weeks. Herbs followed, thyme, rosemary, bay leaves. Each addition was careful, measured not by weight or volume, but by instinct, by the knowledge that lived in his hands and his nose and his tongue. The Critic's getting impatient, one of the servers reported from the dining room. She's asking about her meal. Luca nodded but didn't rush. This dish couldn't be hurried. It needed time to become what it was meant to be, needed the long, slow process of tough meat breaking down, of flavors melding and deepening, of simple ingredients transforming into something transcendent. But he could feel the weight of everyone's stares, the pressure of their expectations and fears. These people had treated him like he was invisible for 2 years, and now their entire livelihoods depended on him. On a dish that wasn't even supposed to exist, made by someone who wasn't even supposed to be able to cook. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. As the stew simmered, Luca turned his attention to the accompaniments. Not the fussy microgreens and artistic smears that Du Bois favored, but simple preparations that would complement rather than compete. Polenta, creamy, rich, made with good butter and real Parmigiano Reggiano. Roasted vegetables that would add color and sweetness. Bread to soak up the sauce. This is taking too long. Martinez was pacing now, his anxiety palpable. Restaurant food doesn't take hours to cook. The critic's going to walk out. Then let her walk, Lucas said, tasting the sauce and adjusting the seasoning. If she can't wait for something worth waiting for, maybe she's not the critic we thought she was. It was a bold statement from someone who'd never spoken above a whisper in this kitchen before. But something had changed in Luca over the past hour. Maybe it was the familiar comfort of cooking, or maybe it was the realization that he literally had nothing left to lose. Either way, he felt different, stronger, more himself than he'd been in years. The dish was almost ready. The meat was fork tender, falling apart at the slightest touch. The sauce had reduced to a glossy, wine-dark perfection that coated the back of a spoon. The polenta was silky and rich, the vegetables perfectly caramelized. But as Luca prepared to plate, a new voice cut through the kitchen's tense quiet. "What the hell is going on here?" Monsieur Beaumont stood in the kitchen doorway, his face flushed with rage and what looked like too much wine. The restaurant's owner was a small, thin man who always seemed to be wound too tight. But tonight, he looked like he might actually explode. "Where is Du Bois?" he demanded. "Why is there a dishwasher at my stove? Why does it smell like a bistro in here instead of a proper restaurant?" The kitchen held its breath. This was it. The moment where everything would either come together or fall completely apart. Luca met Beaumont's eyes and saw his own future hanging in the balance. But he also saw something else. Behind the anger and the panic, he saw fear. The same fear that had been driving everyone in this kitchen all night. The fear of failure, of loss, of admitting that maybe they'd been doing everything wrong. Chef Du Bois left, Lucas said simply. The critic is waiting. Someone had to cook. Beaumont's face went through several shades of red. Someone qualified. Someone trained. Not some nobody who doesn't even. "Taste it," Luca interrupted. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the kitchen staff exchanged glances, waiting to see if the kid who'd been invisible for 2 years had finally lost his mind completely. Beaumont stared at him. "Excuse me." "Taste it," Luca repeated, ladling a small portion of the brasato onto a spoon. "Then decide if it's good enough for your critic." For a moment, it seemed like Beaumont might refuse, might fire Luca on the spot and send him back to the dish pit where he belonged, might choose pride over pragmatism and let the whole restaurant burn rather than admit that a 17-year-old dishwasher might know something about cooking. But the smell was impossible to ignore. Rich, complex, inviting. It filled the kitchen like a promise of better things to come. Beaumont took the spoon. He tasted, and his expression changed completely. Victoria Ashford had perfected the art of intimidation over 23 years as a food critic. She knew exactly how to sit, spine straight, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised, to communicate that she was not here to be entertained or impressed, but to judge. Her notebook lay open beside her plate, fountain pen poised like a weapon, ready to dissect whatever culinary offering dared to present itself before her. She had destroyed careers with less effort than it took most people to decide what to have for breakfast. Tonight, she was here to end Le Cygne Noir. The decision had been made weeks ago, really. She'd heard the whispers about the declining food quality, the pretentious chef who cared more about Instagram-worthy presentations than actual flavor, the restaurant that had somehow convinced the food world it was worth its astronomical prices despite serving what amounted to expensive disappointment. It was exactly the kind of establishment that gave fine dining a bad name, and Victoria had built her reputation on exposing such frauds. Her editor had been thrilled when she'd suggested the review. A takedown of Le Cygne Noir? Victoria, darling, it'll be devastating. Absolutely devastating. And devastating was what Victoria did best. She checked her watch, 43 minutes since she'd ordered. In any serious restaurant, this would be unacceptable, but she'd learned to use delays to her advantage. The longer she waited, the more nervous the kitchen became, the more likely they were to make mistakes. By now, they'd probably heard she was here. The staff would be sweating, The chef would be second-guessing himself, and the food that eventually emerged would be a pale shadow of what they might have produced under normal circumstances. It was all quite calculated, really. Victoria had learned long ago that her job wasn't just to taste food. It was to strip away pretense, to expose weakness, to reveal the truth that restaurants tried so desperately to hide behind fancy decor and flowery menu descriptions. She took a sip of the wine she'd ordered, a perfectly adequate Bordeaux that was competently served but hardly memorable. Everything about this place screamed mediocre trying to be special, from the overly formal service to the dining room that looked like it had been decorated by someone who'd read about elegance in a magazine but never actually experienced it. Madame Ashford, the server who appeared at her table, was young, nervous, practically vibrating with anxiety. Your entree will be out momentarily. We, we apologize for the delay. Victoria didn't respond, didn't even look up from her notebook. She'd found that silence was often more devastating than criticism. Let them fill the quiet with their own fears and insecurities. Around her, the dining room hummed with the kind of forced sophistication that always made her teeth ache. Couples celebrating anniversaries with meals they couldn't afford, business dinners where deals were made over dishes that promised more than they delivered, tourists trying to convince themselves they were having an authentic culinary experience. None of them realized they were about to witness the end of an era. Through the pass window, she could catch glimpses of the kitchen, and what she saw confirmed her suspicions. Chaos, panic, the telltale signs of a restaurant in its death throes. She'd seen it dozens of times before. The moment when the pressure became too much, when the facade cracked, when everyone finally admitted what they'd known all along. They weren't good enough. Victoria had grown up in kitchens like these, watching her father struggle to keep his small restaurant afloat while critics like her, like she would become, picked apart his efforts with surgical precision. She'd seen what hope looked like when it died, had watched dreams crumble under the weight of expectations that could never be met. That was why she was so good at what she did. She knew exactly where to aim to make it hurt the most. Madam, a different server now, older, trying to project confidence, but failing miserably. Your entree. Victoria looked up as the plate was set before her, and for the first time all evening, her carefully constructed mask of boredom slipped slightly. This wasn't what she'd expected. The plate was simple, almost rustic. None of the architectural presentation she'd been prepared to mock, none of the pretentious garnishes that would have given her easy targets for derision. Instead, there was just food. Real food. A generous portion of what appeared to be braised beef in a rich, dark sauce, accompanied by creamy polenta and roasted vegetables that looked like they'd been cooked with actual care rather than artful arrangement. It smelled like something she remembered from very long ago. "What is this?" she asked, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The server swallowed hard. It's brasato al burrolo, madam. Braised beef and wine sauce with polenta and seasonal vegetables. This isn't what I ordered. Victoria's pen was already moving, ready to note the kitchen's inability to fulfill basic requests. I ordered the duck confit. Yes, madam. But there were some complications in the kitchen tonight, and the chef. That is, we thought you might enjoy. The server was stammering now, clearly out of his depth. Victoria felt the familiar rush of power that came with watching someone crumble under her gaze. This was exactly the kind of amateur hour incompetence she'd come here to document. But the smell kept distracting her. It reminded her of something she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten it existed. Sunday dinners at her grandmother's house, when she was very small, before the divorce, before the move to New York, before her mother had decided that Victoria needed to learn how to be sophisticated instead of happy. Her grandmother had made a dish that smelled like this, rich and wine-dark and full of love. I didn't order this, Victoria repeated, but her voice lacked its usual edge. I'm not going to review a dish I didn't request. Please, madam, the server said, and there was something desperate in his voice now. Just taste it. Please. Victoria should have sent the plate back. Should have demanded to speak to the manager. Should have used this obvious failure of service as the opening salvo in the review that would close Luce Signa Noir forever. It would have been easy, justified, even. They'd had one job, and they'd failed at it spectacularly. Instead, she picked up her fork. The meat fell apart at the slightest touch, not the mushy dissolution of something overcooked, but the tender surrender of something that had been coaxed into perfection through patience and skill. The sauce clung to it like silk, dark and glossy and complex in a way that made her mouth water before she'd even tasted it. She took a bite, and the world stopped. It wasn't just the flavor, though the flavor was extraordinary, layers of wine and herbs and deep, satisfying richness that spoke of hours of careful attention. It wasn't just the technique, though she could taste the skill in every element, from the perfectly rendered fat to the polenta that was somehow both light and substantial. It was the soul. This dish had a soul, something that couldn't be taught in culinary school or bought with expensive ingredients or faked with pretty plating. This dish had been made by someone who understood that food was about more than nutrition or even pleasure. It was about connection, about love, about the fundamental human need to nurture and be nurtured. Victoria took another bite, then another, and with each taste, 23 years of carefully constructed armor began to crack. She'd spent her career dismissing food like this as rustic or unsophisticated. She'd built her reputation on celebrating dishes that prioritized technique over heart, presentation over substance. She'd convinced herself that Real cuisine was about innovation and artistry and pushing boundaries, not about the simple, honest pleasure of a perfectly braised piece of meat. But this was what she'd been searching for all along without even realizing it. Her grandmother's brasato had never looked like much, just chunks of beef swimming in dark sauce, served on chipped plates in a kitchen that smelled like garlic and love. But it had tasted like home, like safety, like the kind of unconditional acceptance that Victoria had spent most of her adult life trying to convince herself she didn't need. After the divorce, after the move, after her mother had enrolled her in boarding school to learn proper behavior, Victoria had never tasted anything like it again. She'd told herself she'd outgrown such simple pleasures, that her palate had become too sophisticated for peasant food. But she'd been lying to herself. She'd been lying to herself for decades. The tears came without warning, hot and shameful and completely beyond her control. She pressed her napkin to her eyes, hoping no one would notice, but it was too late. The carefully constructed mask of Victoria Ashford, feared food critic, had finally cracked completely. And underneath, it was just Vicky, a little girl who missed her grandmother's cooking and had spent her entire career trying to find it again in all the wrong places. The dining room around her seemed to fade away. She was 8 years old again, standing on a step stool in her grandmother's kitchen, learning to brown meat properly, to build flavors layer by layer, to cook with love instead of ego. Her grandmother's hands had been gentle and patient, guiding her through each step, never rushing, never criticizing. La cucina al cœur de la casa, her grandmother had always said. The kitchen is the heart of the home. Victoria had spent 23 years forgetting that lesson, convincing herself that restaurants were about business and technique and critical analysis. But they weren't, not really. At their best, they were about that same simple truth her grandmother had known instinctively. Food was love made tangible. She looked down at the plate, now half empty, and realized that whoever had cooked this understood that truth in a way that most chefs never would. This wasn't the work of someone trying to impress or intimidate or prove their worth. This was the work of someone who cooked the way her grandmother had cooked, with patience and care and an understanding that the highest compliment you could pay someone was to feed them well. "Excuse me." Victoria's voice was thick with tears she couldn't quite control. "I need to speak to the chef who prepared this." The server looked terrified. "Madam, the kitchen is very busy right now and I need to speak to him," Victoria repeated, and this time her voice carried not the cold authority of a critic, but the raw vulnerability of someone whose armor had been completely stripped away. Please. She needed to know who had done this to her, who had taken her carefully constructed defenses and demolished them with nothing more than a plate of braised beef, who had reminded her of everything she'd lost, everything she'd forgotten, everything she'd spent her career running away from. But more than that, she needed to thank them. For the first time in 23 years, Victoria Ashford had tasted something that made her remember why she'd fallen in love with food in the first place. Luca's hands shook as he untied his apron. Not the stained dishwasher's apron he'd worn for 2 years, but the clean chef's apron that Marie had found for him somewhere in the chaos. He couldn't quite believe what was happening. Victoria Ashford, The woman whose reviews could make or break careers was asking to see him. The kitchen had gone dead silent when the message came back from the dining room. Even Martinez, who'd spent the entire evening predicting disaster, stood frozen by the pass window with his mouth hanging open. "She wants to see the chef," the server had said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's crying." Victoria Ashford. Crying. Over his food. Luca had never imagined that success could feel so terrifying. "Go," Beaumont said, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. The restaurant owner had been transformed by that single taste of brasato. The angry, desperate man who'd stormed into the kitchen had been replaced by someone who looked like he'd just witnessed a miracle. "Go talk to her." "I don't know what to say," Luca admitted. The confidence that had carried him through the cooking process was evaporating now, replaced by the familiar fear of not being enough, of not belonging, of being found out as a fraud. "Say whatever's in your heart," Marie said softly. She'd been watching him with something like awe ever since he'd started cooking, as if she was seeing him for the first time. "That's what you cooked with?" "That's what she tasted." Luca nodded. Though his heart was hammering so hard, he was sure everyone could hear it. He'd spent 2 years perfecting the art of being invisible, and now he was about to walk into a dining room full of strangers and face the most feared critic in the culinary world. But as he pushed through the kitchen doors, he thought about Nana, about how she'd never let fear stop her from doing what was right, from taking care of the people she loved, about how she'd taught him that cooking wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about nourishing them, body and soul. The dining room felt different now. The forced sophistication and barely contained panic had been replaced by something else, a sense of anticipation, of witnessing something important. Conversations had died away, and dozens of eyes followed Luca as he made his way across the room. He'd never been looked at like this before, not with curiosity or interest or anything approaching respect. For 2 years, he'd been part of the furniture, as invisible as the plates he washed or the floors he mopped. Now, suddenly, he was the center of attention, and it was overwhelming. Victoria Ashford sat at table 12, and she looked nothing like the intimidating figure he'd glimpsed through the pass window. Her perfect composure was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her usually impeccable makeup slightly smeared. She looked, Luca realized with a start, human. "You asked to see me?" His voice came out smaller than he'd intended, and he cleared his throat, trying to find some semblance of confidence. Victoria looked up at him, and her expression was unlike anything he'd expected. Not the cold judgment he'd prepared for, not the casual dismissal he'd grown used to from everyone in his life. Instead, she looked at him with something that might have been recognition. "You're just a boy," she said softly, and there was wonder in her voice. Luca felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm 17. 17. Victoria shook her head as if she couldn't quite process this information. "You cooked this?" She gestured to her plate, which was nearly empty now. "Yes, ma'am." "Where did you learn to cook like this?" It was a simple question, but it hit Luca right in the chest. Because the truth was complicated, painful, beautiful all at once. The truth was about a little boy who'd been abandoned by his parents and rescued by a grandmother who'd poured all her love into feeding him. About nights spent standing on a step stool, learning to make magic with simple ingredients. About loss and grief and the way food could carry memories across years and miles. "My grandmother," he said finally. "She raised me. She taught me that food is how we take care of each other." Something flickered across Victoria's face. Pain, recognition, something deeper than he could name. "Your grandmother," she repeated, her voice barely audible. "What was her name?" "Rosa Benedetti," Lucas said, wondering why this mattered, why this feared critic was asking about his dead Nana with tears still fresh in her eyes. Victoria's breath caught. For a moment, she just stared at him, and Luca had the strangest feeling that she was seeing something else entirely, someone else entirely. "Rosa," she whispered. Little Rosa who worked at DeMarco's grocery store, who made the most incredible brasato in all of Little Italy. The world tilted sideways. Luca felt like he was falling, even though his feet were still firmly planted on the restaurant's polished floor. "You knew her?" "Knew her?" Victoria laughed, but it was a broken sound, more sob than joy. "She was my best friend. We were 8 years old, standing side by side in her mother's kitchen every Sunday, learning to cook together." learning that food was love. The dining room around them had gone completely silent. Even the servers had stopped pretending to work, transfixed by the impossible scene unfolding at table 12. "That's impossible," Lucas said. But even as the words left his mouth, he was remembering things. Stories Nana had told him about a little girl named Vicky who used to help in the kitchen, who had to move away when her parents divorced. Stories about friendship lost too young, about promises to stay in touch that couldn't survive the distance and the years. "She had a scar," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger. "Right here, on her left hand, from when she burned herself on the stove trying to make polenta for the first time. She was so proud of that scar, said it was her first cooking battle wound." Luca's knees went weak. Nana had shown him that scar 100 times, had told him the story of how she'd been so eager to impress her friend Vicky that she'd grabbed a hot pan handle without thinking. "She talked about you," he said, his voice cracking. "She said you were like a sister to her. She said losing you was one of the great sorrows of her life." Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. The tears came in earnest now, 23 years of buried grief pouring out all at once. "I tried to find her," she sobbed. "When I started making money, when I became successful, I hired investigators. But she'd married, changed her name. Rosa Benedetti. I never thought to look for Rosa Benedetti. She married my grandfather when she was 19, Lucas said, sinking into the chair across from Victoria without invitation. His legs couldn't hold him anymore. "Giuseppe Benedetti. They had my father, but he wasn't a good man. He left when I was 3. Left me and my mother. And when my mother decided she didn't want to be a mother anymore, Nana took me in." The story poured out of him. All the pain and loss and abandonment he'd carried for so long. The way Rosa had saved him, had given him a home and a family and an identity built around love instead of rejection. The way she died 3 years ago, leaving him alone in the world with nothing but her recipes and her memories and the crushing weight of grief. "She used to say that cooking was how we stayed connected to the people we love," Luca continued, wiping his own eyes now. "That every time we made their recipes, they were with us again. I cook her brasato when I miss her the most." Victoria reached across the table and took his hands, scarred from dishes, calloused from work, young but already marked by hardship. "She never forgot you either," she said. "She used to wonder what happened to little Vicky, if she was happy, if she remembered their Sunday cooking lessons. She kept a picture," Lucas said suddenly, the memory hitting him like lightning. "In her recipe box, an old photograph of 2 little girls in a kitchen covered in flour. She said it was her and her best friend, the one who taught her that friendship could survive anything except distance." Victoria's face crumpled. "I have the same picture. It's the only one I kept from before everything changed. I used to look at it and wonder if she became a chef, if she found happiness in food the way we dreamed about when we were children." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 23 lost years settling between them. Around them, the dining room remained frozen, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something sacred, something that couldn't be interrupted or explained. "She would have been so proud of you," Victoria said finally. "The way you cook, it's exactly like she did. With your whole heart. With love as the main ingredient." "She would have been proud of you too," Luca replied. "She used to read your reviews. She never made the connection. The name was different, and you looked so different from the little girl in the picture. But she always said Victoria Ashford was the only critic who really understood what food was supposed to be about. It was a lie, but a beautiful one." Nana had actually complained about Victoria's reviews, had said they were too harsh, too focused on technique instead of soul. But she'd also said that anyone who wrote that passionately about food must have once loved it the way it deserved to be loved. "I lost my way," Victoria admitted. "After they sent me to boarding school, after I learned to be sophisticated and refined, I forgot everything Rosa taught me. I spent 23 years punishing restaurants for not serving the kind of food we used to make together, and I didn't even realize that's what I was doing." "But you remembered tonight," Lucas said. "When you tasted the brasato. You remembered." Victoria nodded, squeezing his hands tighter. "It was like she was there with me again. Like I was 8 years old, tasting real food for the first time. Food made with love instead of ego." Monsieur Beaumont appeared at their table, his face pale with anxiety. He'd clearly been watching from a distance, trying to read the situation, trying to understand whether his restaurant was about to be saved or destroyed. Madam Ashford, he said carefully, I hope everything was to your satisfaction? Victoria looked up at him, and for the first time in 23 years of professional dining, she smiled at a restaurant owner with genuine warmth instead of calculated politeness. Victoria Ashford had never written a review while crying before. She sat in her hotel room at 3 a.m., laptop open, cursor blinking on a blank page. For 23 years, reviews had flowed from her fingers like poison, precise, cutting, designed to dissect and destroy. She could write a career-ending review in her sleep. But this was different. How do you review a restaurant that gave you back your soul? How do you find words for the moment when everything you thought you knew about yourself crumbles and rebuilds in the space of a single bite? She'd spent 3 hours at Le Cygne Noir after that first taste of Brazzato. 3 hours talking to Luca, to Beaumont, to the staff who'd watched their world transform before their eyes. 3 hours learning about a boy who'd been invisible for so long that everyone had forgotten he existed. Until the moment he stepped forward and saved them all. The story was impossible, beautiful, heartbreaking. A 17-year-old dishwasher whose grandmother had been her childhood best friend. A critic who'd spent decades running from the very thing she'd been searching for. A restaurant on the brink of failure, saved by the most unlikely hero imaginable. But how do you tell that story without sounding insane? How do you explain that you'd come to destroy a place and left feeling like you'd been reborn? Victoria's fingers hovered over the keyboard, and then slowly, carefully, she began to type. Le Cygne Noir, a revelation. By Victoria Ashford. I have spent 23 years as a food critic. I have eaten at restaurants on 6 continents, reviewed meals that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and built my reputation on the ability to dissect culinary efforts with surgical precision. I have closed restaurants with a single star and launched careers with 4. I thought I knew everything there was to know about food. I was wrong. Last night, I walked into Le Cygne Noir expecting to write the review that would close its doors forever. The restaurant has been struggling. That much was obvious from the half-empty dining room, the nervous service, the sense of desperation that hung over the place like fog. I came armed with my usual arsenal of critical observations, ready to deliver the final blow to an establishment that seemed to be dying anyway. Instead, I received a gift I didn't know I needed. Due to what I later learned was a kitchen crisis of epic proportions, I was served not the dish I'd ordered, but something entirely different. Something extraordinary. Something that changed not just my evening, but my understanding of what food can be when it's prepared with genuine love. The Brazzato al Barolo that appeared before me was not restaurant food in any conventional sense. It wasn't artfully plated or architecturally composed. It wasn't innovative or trendy or designed to photograph well for social media. It was, quite simply, the most honest dish I've ever eaten. But the real story isn't about the food. It's about the person who cooked it. His name is Luca Benedetti, and until last night, he was Le Cygne Noir's dishwasher. 17 years old, orphaned, working 14-hour days in a kitchen where he was treated as invisible. He learned to cook not in culinary school or under celebrity chefs, but from his grandmother in a tiny apartment kitchen, learning that food is love made tangible. When the head chef abandoned his post on the busiest night of the year, when the entire kitchen staff panicked and the restaurant faced certain ruin, this boy, this child, stepped forward. He cooked the only thing he knew how to cook, his grandmother's recipe, elevated by years of quiet observation and passionate practice. The dish he created was flawless not because of technique or expensive ingredients, but because it was made with something that can't be taught in any culinary school: soul. I tasted that soul. I tasted the love of a grandmother who raised an abandoned boy, the grief of loss, the hope of someone who'd never been given a chance but refused to stop believing in himself. I tasted 23 years of my own lost dreams, memories I thought I'd buried forever, the simple truth about why I fell in love with food in the first place. That dish broke me open and put me back together. I learned later that Luca's grandmother and I were childhood friends, a connection lost to time and circumstance, recovered in the most impossible way imaginable. But even without that personal connection, what happened last night would have been profound. Because Luca Benedetti represents something that our industry has forgotten in its pursuit of innovation and recognition and profit. He represents the truth that the best food isn't about impressing people. It's about nourishing them. Le Signa Noir is not a perfect restaurant. The service needs work, the wine list could be improved, and the dining room decor is trying too hard to be something it's not. But none of that matters, because they have something that most restaurants spend years trying to find and never do. They have a chef who understands that food is sacred. I'm giving Le Signa Noir 4 stars, not for what it is now, but for what it has the potential to become under Luca's guidance. Yes, Monsieur Beaumont has offered him the head chef position, and yes, he has accepted, though he insists on finishing his education first. But more than that, I'm using this review to make a confession and an apology. I have spent my career punishing restaurants for not living up to standards I didn't even understand. I've been harsh, cutting, sometimes cruel, all in the name of maintaining excellence. I told myself I was protecting diners from mediocrity, that my harsh reviews served a greater good. The truth is, I was a lost little girl looking for something I'd forgotten how to name. I was searching for the taste of home, of love, of food that nourished the soul as well as the body. And every time I didn't find it, I lashed out with words designed to wound. I was searching for my friend Rosa's Brazado, and I punished every restaurant that couldn't provide what I'd never even admitted I was looking for. Last night, a 17-year-old boy gave me back something I'd lost so long ago I'd forgotten it existed. He reminded me why I fell in love with food, why I became a critic, why any of this matters. Food is love. Cooking is an act of generosity. And the highest purpose of any restaurant is not to impress or intimidate, but to nourish body, heart, and soul. Luca Benedetti understands this instinctively. Watch for his name. Remember it. Because this boy who was invisible for so long is going to change everything. As for me, I'm taking a sabbatical. For the first time in 23 years, I want to learn to cook again, not to criticize, but to create. Not to judge, but to love. Rosa Benedetti would have been proud of her grandson. She would have been proud of what he's become, what he's accomplished, what he represents. I hope she would have been proud of me too, for finally finding my way back to what she tried to teach us both all those years ago. Le Signa Noir is located at 142 Harbor Street, Crescent Harbor. Reservations recommended. 5 stars rating. Victoria saved the file and leaned back in her chair, emotionally exhausted. She'd never written anything like this before. So personal, so vulnerable, so completely contrary to everything her reputation was built on. Her editor was going to hate it. Her colleagues would think she'd lost her mind. The industry would be scandalized by a critic who'd abandoned objectivity so completely. She didn't care. For the first time in decades, she'd written something true. Something that mattered. Something that honored the memory of a woman who'd tried to teach 2 little girls that love was the most important ingredient in any recipe. Outside her hotel window, dawn was breaking over Crescent Harbor. In a few hours, her review would be published online, and by evening it would be in print. By tomorrow, everything would change. For Luca, for Le Signa Noir, for her. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, she'd done something she hadn't done since she was 8 years old. She'd cooked with love. 6 months later, Le Signa Noir bore little resemblance to the restaurant Victoria had first entered. The pretentious decor was gone, replaced by warm woods and simple elegance. The intimidating formal service had been replaced by staff who smiled genuinely and spoke about the food with real passion. The dining room, once half-empty and desperate, now required reservations weeks in advance. But the biggest change was in the kitchen. Lucas stood at the pass, reviewing plates before they went out to the dining room. At 18 now, he'd grown into his role as head chef with a confidence that still sometimes surprised him. He wore the title lightly, without the ego or arrogance that had defined his predecessor. His kitchen ran on respect rather than fear, creativity rather than rigid hierarchy. Chef, Marie approached with a ticket in her hand. She'd been promoted to sous chef, a decision that had shocked no one who'd watched her support Luca from the beginning. Table 7 is asking if we can modify the brazado for their daughter's food allergies. Of course, Lucas said without hesitation. What does she need us to avoid? In the old kitchen, under Chef Du Bois, such a request would have been met with contempt. The chef's vision was sacred, not to be altered for anyone's convenience. But Luca had learned different lessons from his grandmother. Food was meant to bring people together, not exclude them. As he worked on the modified dish, Luca thought about how much had changed since that impossible night. Victoria's review had indeed transformed everything, not just the restaurant's fortunes, but the entire conversation about what fine dining could be. Other critics had started examining their own biases, their own forgotten connections to food as something more than technical achievement. Young cooks from around the world had started making pilgrimages to Crescent Harbor, wanting to learn from the teenager who'd reminded everyone that soul mattered more than skill. Luca tried to teach them what Nana had taught him, that the most important ingredient couldn't be bought or measured or taught in school. It had to be felt. Chef Luca, a server appeared at his elbow. There's someone here to see you. Says she has a reservation, but also that she's an old friend. Luca looked up to see Victoria Ashford walking into his kitchen, and his face broke into a grin. She looked different, softer, more relaxed. The severe styling was gone, replaced by something that looked more like the 8-year-old girl from Nana's photograph. Victoria. He wiped his hands on his apron and embraced her warmly. You didn't tell me you were coming. I wanted to surprise you, she said, looking around the kitchen with obvious pleasure. Besides, I have news. Over the past 6 months, Victoria had become something like family, the closest thing to an Aunt Luca had ever had. She'd kept her promise about taking a sabbatical from criticism, spending her time learning to cook again, rediscovering the joy she'd lost. She'd also become one of Le Cygne Noir's most vocal champions, recommending it to everyone who would listen. What kind of news? Luca asked, though he could tell from her expression that it was good. I'm writing a cookbook, Victoria announced. But not just any cookbook. A collection of recipes from Rose's kitchen, the ones I remember from when we were children, combined with the evolved versions you've created. I want to call it Nana's Legacy, Recipes for the Soul. Luca felt tears prick his eyes. She would have loved that. She would have loved all of this, Victoria said, gesturing around the bustling kitchen. Look what you've built, Luca. Look what you've become. It was true. The boy who'd been invisible for so long had become the most talked about young chef in the country. But more than that, he'd stayed true to the lessons Nana had taught him. Success hadn't changed him. It had simply given him a bigger platform to share her wisdom. I couldn't have done it without you, Luca said. Without that night, without your review. You would have found a way, Victoria interrupted. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe the path would have been different. But someone with your heart, with your understanding of what food really means, you were always going to make it. A timer chimed, calling Luca's attention back to the stove. As he plated the modified brasato, he thought about the miracle of connection. How two lost souls had found each other through a dish that carried the love of a woman who'd been gone for 3 years, but whose influence lived on in every meal he cooked. Table 7, modified brasato, he called out, and watched the plate disappear into the dining room. Somewhere in that dining room was a little girl who would be able to enjoy a meal with her family because he'd been willing to adapt, to include rather than exclude. Maybe she'd remember this dinner years from now. Maybe she'd grow up thinking that good food was about generosity rather than gatekeeping. Maybe she'd learn what Nana had tried to teach him, that the kitchen was the heart of the home, and the heart should always have room for one more. Are you ready for service? Marie asked, and Luca nodded. Another night, another chance to feed people well. Another opportunity to turn simple ingredients into something that nourished more than just the body. Another moment to honor the woman who'd taught him that love was the most important recipe of all. As the orders started coming in and the kitchen found its rhythm, Luca caught sight of Victoria through the pass window. She was seated at her usual table, table 12, where everything had changed 6 months ago, and she was taking notes. Not for a review this time, but for the cookbook that would preserve Nana's memory and share her wisdom with a new generation. The circle was complete. The lost had been found. The invisible had become essential. And in a kitchen that hummed with purpose and joy, a boy who'd never expected to matter was proving every day that the smallest acts of love could change the world. One dish at a time. Epilogue, 5 years later. Victoria Ashford Benedetti, she'd legally changed her name to honor both her friend and her chosen family, stood in the kitchen of the Rosa Benedetti Culinary Institute, watching her students prepare for their final exam. The school, funded by the success of both Le Cygne Noir and her best-selling cookbook, had become a place where young cooks learned not just technique, but the deeper lessons about what food could be. Luca, now 23 and wearing his success with the same humble grace he'd always possessed, moved between the students like the master teacher he'd become. His restaurants, 3 now, all built on the same principles Nana had taught him, were considered the gold standard for soulful cooking. But his greatest pride was here, in this classroom, watching young cooks discover that their hands could create more than just meals. They could create connections, healing, love. Remember, he told a nervous student who was struggling with her brazado, it's not about perfection. It's about intention. Cook with love, and the technique will follow. Victoria smiled, remembering another nervous cook who had learned that same lesson in a very different kitchen, on a night when everything fell apart and came together all at once. Through the window, she could see the statue they'd erected in the school's courtyard, a bronze figure of an elderly woman with gentle hands, teaching a child to cook. The plaque read simply, Rosa Benedetti, 1938 to 2018, she taught us that food is love made visible. Every day, students and visitors left flowers at the base of that statue. Flowers, and sometimes small offerings of food, pieces of bread, perfect tomatoes, herbs from their gardens. Offerings to the woman who'd never known how far her love would travel, how many lives it would touch, how her simple lessons about cooking with care would ripple out through generations. Luca caught Victoria's eye and smiled, the same warm expression that had first appeared on his face when he'd realized who she was. In 5 years, they'd built something beautiful together, not just businesses or books or schools, but a family. The family that Rosa had always wanted them to have. The connection that had been interrupted by time and circumstance, but never truly broken. She would be so proud, Victoria whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking about the woman in the statue or the man he'd become. Maybe both. Maybe it didn't matter. Because love, once planted, grows in directions you can never predict. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it grows into something that feeds the world. If you made it to the end, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us. See you in the next one.